my lovely assistant. While we're getting the Facebook Live started, I just want to just say how grateful we are for all the efforts that have been going in this past week. We've got some new plantings out here. We had the Boy Scouts here running all over the place, doing all kinds of things, but especially working on the shed. And I think the shed looks as good as it did or better when it actually better than when it was new. And so there is still things to be done, but the Boy Scouts washed down the picnic tables. They did some landscaping a little bit around the shed, but they also, they put in new stairs to it. They fixed it all up, took the moss off of the roof and treated it again so that hopefully that we won't have more moss grow on it for a long time. I hope never. So just give me the signal and I can start.
Well, we had a false start there, and so I entered it because
It was a false start. I
yes.
said.
So I had to start over. All right, I'm ready.
Okay, let's go. So we have seen in the scripture lessons that we've been doing this whole thing that was developing where Samuel in the sermon last week had to, he first met God. And this became the pattern of his life, that he would listen to God and he would speak whether the message was a hard message or not. He learned to speak truth to power by speaking to Eli, who was like, I think, a stepfather or grandfather to him, so it must have been hard to tell him what was coming, but Eli had already heard that. And Eli, as we've said, was not a bad man, but he was somewhat of a weak leader. And so he didn't corral his sons and depose them when they began to abuse God's people and God's offering. And so the warning came. It came through a prophet, and it came through Samuel last week. Now we see that it begins to play out, that this is the fulfillment of what God had sent the message to Eli with multiple warnings. The passage is about a battle that goes on between the Philistines. The Philistines were sea people that had moved in close to the time that the Israelites came back into the land, but the Philistines had superior technology. They had learned to smelt iron. And at some points, the Israelites, if they wanted to have an iron plow, they would have to go to the Philistines because they didn't have the technology. They had bronze technology. And I believe the Philistines also had chariots, which would have been in open plains and fields a real advantage. It would be like the tanks of the current world and the ancient world. The Israelites were a strong group, but they weren't strong enough. And so the Philistines kept afflicting them, and a judge would show up and would push off the yoke of the burden of the Philistines, and then they would get the upper hand again. So now we have this battle. And we don't know all of the precursor to it, whether Israel picked this fight thinking that they could now destroy the yoke on them from the Philistines, but in chapter 4, we pick up where this battle happens. And it appears that the people did not consult Samuel, who was probably still quite young at this time. They just decided it was time to make a change. So the first part of chapter 4 in verse 1 probably belongs in chapter 3 at the end of that rather than the beginning, because it says, and the word of Samuel came to all Israel. But it seems to be tied to what we read last week more than what's coming now. Second part of verse 1 starts here. Now Israel went out to battle against the Philistines, and they encamped at Ebenezer. The Philistines encamped at Aphek. The Philistines drew up in line against Israel, and when the battle spread, Israel was defeated before the Philistines, who killed about 4,000 men on the field of battle. And when the people came to the camp, the elders of Israel said, why has the Lord defeated us today before the Philistines? Let us bring the ark of the covenant of the Lord here from Shiloh, that it may come among us and save us from the power of our enemies. So the people sent to Shiloh and brought from there the ark of the covenant of the Lord of hosts, who is enthroned on the cherubim. And the two sons of Eli, Hophni and Phinehas, were there with the ark of the covenant of God. As soon as the ark of the covenant of the Lord came into the camp, all Israel gave a mighty shout, so that the earth resounded. And when the Philistines heard the noise of the shouting, they said, "What does this great shouting in the camp of the Hebrews mean?" And when they learned that the ark of the Lord had come to the camp, the Philistines were afraid, for they said, "A god has come into the camp." And they said, "Woe to us, for nothing like this has happened before. Woe to us! Who can deliver us from the power of these mighty gods? These are the gods who struck the Egyptians with every sort of plague in the wilderness. Take courage and be men, O Philistines, lest you become slaves to the Hebrews, as they have been to you. Be men and fight." And so the Philistines fought, and Israel was defeated. And they fled, every man to his home. And there was a very great slaughter, for 30,000 foot soldiers of Israel fell. And the ark of God was captured, and the two sons of Eli, Hophni and Phinehas, died. A man of Benjamin ran from the battle line and came to Shiloh on the same day, with his clothes torn and with dirt on his head. And when he arrived, Eli was sitting on his seat by the road, watching. For his heart trembled for the ark of God. And when the man came into the city and told the news, all the city cried out. When Eli heard the sound of the outcry, he said, "What is this uproar?" Then the man hurried and came and told Eli. Now Eli was 98 years old, and his eyes were set so that he could not see. And the man said to Eli, "I am he who has come from the battle. I fled from the battle today." And he said, "How did it go, my son?" He who brought the news answered and said, "Israel has fled before the Philistines, and there's also been a great defeat among the people. Your two sons also, Hophni and Phinehas, are dead, and the ark of God has been captured." As soon as he mentioned the ark of God, Eli fell over backward from his seat by the side of the gate, and his neck was broken, and he died. For the man was old and heavy. He had judged Israel 40 years. Now his daughter-in-law, the wife of Phinehas, was pregnant and about to give birth. And when she heard the news that the ark of God was captured and that her father-in-law and her husband were dead, she bowed and gave birth, for her pains came upon her. And about the time of her death, the woman attending her said to her, "Don't be afraid, for you've borne a son." But she did not answer or pay attention. And she named the child Ichabod, saying, "The glory has departed from Israel." That's what Ichabod means. Because the ark of God had been captured, and because of her father-in-law and her husband. And she said, "The glory has departed from Israel, for the ark of God has been captured." And God add his understanding to this reading, this difficult reading from his word. Can you imagine that the last thing that the woman says is, "Ichabod, the glory has departed"? The Ark of the Covenant was never supposed to be something that could be captured. It symbolized God's presence. This is the same God who led the Israelites out of Egypt with 10 plagues, each one worse than the one before. They had defeated the superpower of the age, the Egyptians, and now they're faced with defeat. And this is God's chosen people. In Fiddler on the Roof, there's a line that Tevye says when he's out there having one of his conversations with God. He says, "I know that we're supposed to be the chosen people, but maybe with all this that we're going through, you should choose somebody else." Something to that effect. They were God's chosen people, but they were not following God's ways. Some of the people almost undoubtedly were and must have been heartbroken to see what had been going on, the corruption in the highest parts of their country, which was the priesthood, who also were serving as the political leader, and Eli. And Eli, like I've said, I believe he was basically not a bad man, just a very weak leader and not the best dad. Because he let his sons get away with almost murder. He let them exploit the women. He allowed them to take the Lord's offering instead of giving the best, the fat portions to God. And he was warned multiple times, as we've said before. So it seems to me like a strange thing that this would be the time that Israel says, oh, we're ready. Let's go out and throw those Philistines out of here, and not even consulting God. In the wilderness, you get the idea that God was in command, that they were listening to God. That when the ark moved, they moved with it. They didn't get the idea of, okay, let's move the ark and go and find another campsite. God spoke through Moses at that time. And he spoke to them in such a way that he said it's time to move, and they would move. They were responding to God. They weren't trying to make it up as they go. But they had reached a place where God may have been honored in name, but not in reality at the level that it needed to be. I sometimes feel as though in our own nation that we give lip service to God. I don't mean you, but I mean in public places where it's still allowed. Used to be even at the commencements, there would be a priest or a pastor or a rabbi who would give the invocation. Doesn't happen now, at least around here. But even that could have been lip service if we're not truly following God's ways. And so the people are tired of being oppressed by those Philistines. If we can just get rid of the Philistines, they think everything will be so good for us. And they get the idea to go out and battle, evidently, unless, I don't know, the Philistines might have picked the first fight where 4,000 fell. But they made the wrong diagnosis. And that is the thing in history that often has happened when people fail to really see the underlying things that are going on. It's easy to do. They thought, if we just get the ark out there, because we had great times when the ark went before us, didn't we? We got led through the wilderness. Things were wonderful. Well, they weren't so wonderful, but we always remember things better than they really were. We forget about the hardships, and we kind of get the parts about it. I heard this at a conference one time where people were talking about how sad they were that churches are not so full of children and people. It wasn't too long ago, a year or two ago, I was at one of our denominational meetings. And, but they had a few people that were around back in the heyday when the churches were full and the Sunday school was meeting just about in the bathroom because there wasn't enough room. And they went back and they remembered, some of them said, you know, back then you may think those were the heyday, but back then people were complaining, there's not enough room around here. We gotta figure, you know. The people of God at this juncture in Israel's history had not turned their hearts fully to him, at least not in large numbers. There are always faithful people, and there are always those that aren't. But this was a time where Israel wasn't listening much to God. And so they diagnosed the problem as we just need the ark. I mean, we get the ark out there. Well, that's God, that symbolizes God's presence, right? If we just get the ark out there with us, we'll win the battle. Isn't that what they did? Now, some of them may have thought, well, it's not just the ark. I mean, God comes with the ark because he's not going to send the ark out there. That's where he's supposed to be over that mercy seat there. But they made it up on their own, it seems like. And they failed to see that they needed a change of heart among all the people, that they needed to have people truly devoted to God in their leadership had to follow suit, that the leaders of Israel and Eli and his sons were now basically condemned men, which is a hard thing for us in our time to think of. And I get the feeling that deep down what's really going on is that the men bringing the ark out, it had to be the priest to go with it. So Hophni and Phinehas, they go out all ready to fight. You know, not fight, they would just stay with the ark. But they get killed and the ark is captured. Well, that was the judgment of God. It had been predicted beforehand, and now it's playing out. That God kept his word, that if they kept on dishonoring him and dishonoring him and dishonoring him and despising him, there would be something to pay for that. And perhaps the whole reason that that ark went out there, probably disobediently and not certainly of God's direction, seems to be to get Hophni and Phinehas to go through with what had to happen. And it had been predicted they would die on the same day. That's the message to Eli, that his particular clan of the priesthood would no longer be the one, that it was going to shift to another leader who would be more faithful and who would follow God's ways in executing the office that they had. That's a hard message. It's so easy to get on the bandwagon and get excited. We can use all kinds of symbols and think, well, those symbols will save us, but the symbols don't save us. It's what goes on to reinforce and hold those things up, I think, that make the difference in whether or not we as a nation will continue to be the republic that we have enjoyed for since 89, I think it was, the first presidential inauguration of George Washington. The Constitution that we all have come, I hope, to value, because there's nothing like it in all the world. That short document has safeguarded the fact that we can be in this room without fear that the police will come through the door and haul us off. When I was a teenager, the Soviet Union was still seemingly very powerful and a great threat, right? And there was a book that came out called The Persecutor. It was written by one of the persecutors. His name was Sergei Kordakov. And Sergei was part of the secret police in the Soviet Union. And he eventually became a follower of Christ. And what made the difference for him was that he was under orders to go through and to basically beat and in some cases kill some of the Christians who were just having a secret meeting in one of their homes or in a secret gathering. And he was overwhelmed with how awful it was that they were taking and beating people to death who were simply trying to follow their faith. He in turn was apparently killed by the KGB sometime after that, after he came out with that whole story. But he understood apparently that there were more important rights that were there. And so if we are to live on as a republic, we need to continue. There's a clause in the opening preamble of the Constitution that talks about a more perfect union. And our union has not been perfect through its history. There have been some terrible abuses. We've had to learn through painful wars and struggle that all men truly are created equal, and not just all men, but men and women are created equal. We went through a bloody, horrendous civil war in order to end the incredibly evil institution of slavery with a racist kind of a dimension to it that was just intolerable. Over 600,000 men on between the two sides died. That would be 30 million people who would have died in a battle or in a war if you adjust for our population now. Comparable to 30 million people. And so we see the things that are happening around us. First, we get this pandemic. Everything's cranking along. We're doing well. The economy's good. People are getting back to work after years of having kind of slow economies, and we think we're safe. We think we're doing well. And we get hit with this pandemic, which I believe may have some bad roots in terms of it was likely a research lab, although it isn't absolutely proven. And we just start to wake up and get somewhat back on our feet, and the small businesses that have suffered from this, it's been a horrendous thing. Some of them are never going to open again. They were already just basically living hand to mouth. But we just start to begin to open up the economy, and people start to get their health care again who were denied it because the hospitals had to prepare for the pandemic. My own hospital, instead of having 25 or 30 people on each of the floors, they had something like 8 who had anything other that was that urgent that they still needed care. I think Doris could back me up that very few people got their routine kinds of surgeries, their hips replaced, or the other things that were also important. But we just start to recover from that, and then I don't even have a word for the person that did what he did to George Floyd. I've seen parts of the thing, and I've heard what the actual script would be if you heard what was said and done back and forth. And it was horrible. And it was something that I think had the potential, and still has the potential, to unify us as a nation, to figure out what it is that we need to do to make this truly a more perfect union, to overcome some of the things that have been setting people back and holding them from having the opportunities that many of us have enjoyed. And I think that when we look at the protesters out there in the streets, that there are 3 different groups at least, there may be more. There are the genuine protesters who are simply trying to exercise that First Amendment right of both free speech and of the right to congregate. That is a sacred part of the Constitution. That Bill of Rights that was added shortly after the Constitution was completed has been the thing that's made our lives so rich. This experiment that's gone on for over 200, almost 250 years. But mixed in with that group are other groups, aren't they? I mean, the peaceful protesters aren't the ones that are setting the cruisers of the police on fire. They're not the ones throwing the bombs. The Molotov cocktails. The peaceful protesters simply want to have a more just society. They want to correct some of the things, and they may not have all the answers of how to do it, but there are people, politicians, I think, on both sides of the aisle, ready to listen and to try to work on solutions. What troubles me, though, is there is another group besides. So there are the peaceful protesters, then there's Antifa. And Antifa, I truly do believe, is likely a terrorist group, somewhat like the Weather Underground, highly organized, exploiting this situation and stirring up people's anger so that some people who probably wouldn't do some of the things that they've done are doing, or they're doing it from behind them, hiding behind the honest protesters that simply want a better country and a better world. And then there's the third group, those who want lawlessness in such a way because they already tend to shoplift or steal or do things, and they're mixed in with it too. If we want to continue on, I believe God has blessed our nation because we have at least aspired to better things, and we've gradually been learning, and there have been some gains that have been made. But we can hollow out that Constitution and make it meaningless. We can have it just be lofty sounding words that people put on the shelf and forget about. We should know what it says. And it's not just that, but God's people, the church. We should be constantly praying and working also for a more perfect union, because God has left the church here as salt and light, to be the ones that point the way to what the world should be like. We can't bring the kingdom of God into a political realm in the fullest sense of the word. That's something only Jesus is in the process of doing. But we can use what we've learned in whatever way we can to influence the public discourse so that things do get better. We could be out there helping with tutoring and doing things too. There are things that could be done. They failed to diagnose the problem back in Eli's day. And even his daughter-in-law, First, Eli truly, I think, was more upset by far about the ark being captured, because I think at one time he had believed. I think at one time he had been somewhat more earnest in his faith, and he had just gotten kind of lazy and allowed his sons to run all over. And they were the lawless ones in that case, right? And God said no, finally. Now, people ask me, did God bring the pandemic? No, I don't think that directly. There was somebody in a lab in China, in Wuhan, and maybe it was an accident that it got out, but that's a military lab from what I've heard. Why are we messing around with these things that aren't naturally supposed to affect us? So people pursuing their own interests, their own desires are doing these things. But I do feel that sometimes God takes the crises of the world in order to accomplish his purposes. Does that mean he's the author of it? No. But he is one who seeks to get our attention. After 9/11, church attendance surged for about 3 or 4 weeks, and then I went back, and a couple of people stayed in different churches, but overall, they just went back to everything. That wasn't enough of a wake-up call. Then we have the pandemic. We've been here in a similar thing before. I was 8 years old when the riots were happening after Martin Luther King, somebody I have a deep admiration for his approach to protest and to change. Happened, right? And that year was tumultuous politically. I mean, it was really bad. The convention in Chicago, the police were out there too, because it was just rioting and terrible things happening. But we came back together. And I believe that we can come back together again out of this and grow from it. Those who are truly criminals in those protests and those who are terrorists, they need a different way of dealing with them than the peaceful, honest protesters who simply want a more just society and world. But we have to really wrestle with what is justice? What is the approach? We can have dialogue about that. And we can have it in the church as well. What could we do to be involved and to help? Eli's daughter-in-law, I think she misdiagnosed things too. Because she comes to the conclusion that the glory is departed, and that's her final phrase on her lips, naming her son Ichabod, which means the glory is departed. Kabod is a word for glory, and glory symbolizes the presence of God. The Shekinah glory in the inner sanctuary of the temple was God resting with his people and being there enthroned with the mercy seat, a place where people could receive their forgiveness, be understood that they can be made whole and at peace again. That was what was symbolized in that ark. But the ark wasn't gone for good. And the ark wasn't really the main thing anyway, because God never took away his love from his people. He allowed them to be chastened, and it was a severe chastening. But it was on the threshold of something incredible. This was the time when the Lord would begin to speak again through Samuel. We had read in the earlier chapter that the word from God was very rare in those days, and visions were rare. Well, God was now about to begin to speak. And he was bringing in a judge who would be a righteous one, and Samuel, who was also a priest, and who would be anointing first the king that the people wanted. They wanted Saul because he was impressive. He was taller than everybody. He was impressive, and at first he did well, but he didn't have a heart for God. He didn't really know God. We would see if we did a study on Saul. He uses God, or he thinks he does, and he steps over the boundaries that were there, that were supposed to keep a division between the processes of government there, that there was the prophet, priest, and king. He began to try to act not only as the king, but as the prophet and a priest. And it was a grab of power. But on deck was David, and David was the rightful heir to the throne. It had been predicted back in the time when Jacob was giving his dying blessings to his sons that it would be through the tribe of Judah that the kingship would come. Saul was a Benjaminite, a great smaller tribe in Israel who were fierce fighters. They were many left-handed, and so that seemed to give them some advantage in battle. But it was to Judah's line that it would come, not because Judah was perfect, but God knew that David was coming, a man after God's heart, who would also be a frail human being, made terrible mistakes, but God never took his love away from David, because he saw also you and me. And he saw that in this line, he would bring the Messiah, his son, into the world. It would be Jesus who would come, and he will be the one that finally will establish a just and a right government. The government will be upon his shoulders, right? He'll lead with wisdom and vision. Out of all of these tragic things that are going on, and I mourn the loss of George Floyd and the terrible way that he died, I also mourn the loss of some of the retired police captain that was killed trying to help a friend to protect his business. And I mourn the guy that worked for Homeland Security who was murdered. And I mourn the officer who may be forever on a ventilator because he got shot in the head, who's in Texas. I mourn them all of them. And I pray that God will do a great work in our country, that out of the ashes of some of these places where there have been the fires and the problems and the trouble, and it's happened before, I believe it can and will maybe happen again, that we can sit down and figure this out and not just pay lip service to justice and to the good things, but to really work in a concerted effort where everybody has the right to pursue life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, that everybody starts on an even playing field, both educationally and in all the opportunities, and having the resources and investment in the communities that could make a real difference and a long-lasting one. That we might maybe not be a perfect union, but closer to it. I have all kinds of hope. People say, are we in the days of Revelation? Well, we've been in the end times since Jesus left, and many generations have thought they were the last one. So I am very careful not to put the credibility of God's word on the table to say this is the, I mean, it sounds like some of the descriptions of the last times that Jesus and John and others had predicted, but it sounded like that before too. Our thing is that whether it is or it isn't, we are here to occupy and be salt and light until he comes. We need to be doing what he left us here to do. And I believe we can do that, that God can bless the country and his people in new ways and bring about real, lasting, and wonderful change. But it won't just happen. It takes a will and the ability to truly hear one another and not be afraid that we'll be labeled or discounted when we speak. Amen. You have another song. What do you want to do? Say. Mine's a Father's Day song, so I'm going to save it. Oh, that's an idea. Okay.
While the storm clouds gather far across the sea, let us swear allegiance to a land that's free. Let us all be grateful for a land that's so fair. As we raise our voices in a solemn prayer, God bless America, land that I love. With the light from above, white with gold. God bless America. Oh, bless America.